Hello everyone, this is Dipankar, and today we will see how we can handle exceptions in Spring Boot applications in best possible way. Um, to start with, let's go to our browser and then let's type start.spring.io. As we can see, and most of the options I'm going to keep as default. Only few I'm going to change. One of them is the artifact, exception handling, and I'm going to keep the Java version as 11, and then I'm going to need a dependency that is going to be web. Okay, this is pretty much we need to start with. We might need one or more dependencies, later in this course. For now, let's generate this. We have to keep this in desktop so that it's easy for us to access this. Okay, now let's go to desktop. We have this downloaded here, and so let's extract this. So we have this extracted here. Now let's open this with IntelliJ. I'm using IntelliJ 2020 edition. This is a community version, and the community edition is pretty much good enough to cover this course, and it's much more than capable of handling this course actually. Okay, so we have this template project loaded. Now we can go inside our project structure, and then we have this exception handling. Oops, this is not the class, my bad. I was going inside this class, exception handling application. I usually don't prefer having long class names. I'll rather go with main application, and let's rename the other class as well. So this is a basic Spring Boot application with REST dependencies. So that means we can build a REST API on top of this Spring Boot application. In order to qualify this application as a REST application, we need to have a controller class, and to have that we are going to have our package first, and I'm going to name this class as home controller. Okay, so we have our Java class ready, and then we need to annotate this as REST controller. Now Spring Boot will identify this as a Java controller class. Then we need a very basic method to start with. I'm having a method called hello, and I'm just returning a very simple message, hello world, and I'm going to map it to root. Okay, so this is a very basic, this is probably the most basic controller class we can have. Now let's start this. Oops, I have to start the main application. So as we can see, the main application has started. Now we have to use Postman. You can also use web browser also for basic GET APIs. I'm going to use the URL that we have, and that is localhost :8080. So because we are using Spring Web dependencies, Spring Boot Web Starter, that is actually, and that comes bundled with the Tomcat server, and that Tomcat's default port number is 8080. So when I hit the send, we can see that hello world message is being displayed here. This is the same message that we have added here. Okay, so this is the bare skeleton of this application. Now step by step we'll keep adding more features on top of this. Okay, so now in order to start our experiments first, I'm going to have another class, and this is going to be a service class. I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible, and I know the best practice is to have an interface of service and then implement that, but as I said, my idea is to keep it as simple as possible. So I'm having a service class here, and I'm going to annotate this, inject this class in the home controller class. And then I have home service, and that is home service, and I'm going to auto wire this. Okay, so this was the basic class, and I'm going to have another method, public string, and then I'm going to have a method called demo. Now this mapping is going to be different, starting with, again, get mapping again, but this time I'm going to have a parameterized argument, and that is going to be let's say num, and this is going to be handled by a path variable. Taking this one as num as well, and let's take this as int and num. So basically what we would be handling a number variable. This is the number type that we have specified. This is int, and inside this method we would be calling another method that should be coming from the home service class. Now I'm going inside home service, and I'm adding another method here, and another method with same name, but this also takes an argument. I'm going to have the same name, okay, and return all is fine. Okay, now let's go back to our controller class, and from here I'm going to return home service dot demo and the same number that we are receiving from the controller, and I'm going to pass it into this. Now we have set up our demo method, and which is also mapped to a parameter, and then we are going inside demo, and it is printing, it should return string all is fine. And just for readability, I'm going to return the same number just to see if our endpoint is working as expected. Okay, all right, I'm going to restart this application. Okay, this was the root application. If we hit again, we get the same message, but now if I send something else, let's say I'm hitting 8080/5, so now we get all is fine with 5. Now if I type 56, we get the same number that we have, sent to the controller. So that means the second endpoint is working as expected. Okay, so now step by step we'll keep adding our exception scenarios. So now when I receive the number as say 1, then I want to throw one type of exception, that is going to be empty string dot char at 2. So ideally this should throw string index out of bound exception. Okay, but since that is an unchecked exception, okay, that's why we don't get any compilation errors or any warnings from the editor as well. So this is one scenario, and then we are going to have another scenario. For number 2, string myval. Okay, I'm going to initialize this with null, and then on myval I'm calling trim. So this is, I'm trying to throw null pointer exception here. So as myval has been initialized with null, and on top of null we are calling trim. So definitely this is going to throw null pointer exception for us. And if this number is 3, then I'm explicitly throwing a new exception. Okay, and I'm giving a small message. This is a demo. Okay, this is the basic exception scenarios that I have covered. There can be much more scenarios that we can talk about, but I'm trying to keep the scope as limited as possible for this course. Okay, let's get rid of unnecessary lines. Now let's restart the application. Application has started again. If we go back to our editor, we can see we have exception scenarios with only 3 numbers, 1, 2 and 3. Remaining all number will work perfectly fine unless we are giving any non-number arguments. That will break. We have not handled that. We can handle, but again, let's focus on what we are trying to cover. So 3 exception scenarios we have on 1, 2 and 3 parameters. So now let's start with 1 first. So we are getting a 500 error. If we go to our editor and open the console, we can see the same exception I had mentioned earlier. String index out of bounds exception, string index out of range at 2. So this is the line where it is pointing. Okay, cat empty string dot cat at 2. Okay, so this is the entire trace we have for this exception. Now I'm going to clear this console so that we can read the next exception stack trace properly. Now I'm going with parameter 2. Let's hit the send. Again, 500 error we have. This time we have received null pointer exception, and the exception is coming from home service class, line number 16. If we click on that, this is the exact line we are coming from. Okay, myval is null, and on null we are calling trim. That has to raise null pointer exception. Okay, let's go back to the console and again clear this so that we can again read the next exception stack trace properly. I'm going to change this to 3. This should throw a runtime exception. We already have configured that. Again, the 500 error. Let's look at the stack trace. Runtime exception. The message says relax, this is the demo, obviously. So these are the 3 scenarios we have covered. For now, we would see more examples later in this course. So how do we handle these things properly? So this is definitely out of control. The code has broken already. Okay, we need to handle this, and also we need to send a proper message to the caller of this endpoint as well. Okay, so what we can do in this case, there are some scenarios that we can probably cover. One of the examples I can think of is we can have a basic try catch block. Okay, put everything inside of this try and catch them with runtime exception e, and then e dot print stack trace. Okay, so the easier thing would have been to have try catch blocks for each of these, scenarios, but in order to save us some time as well, I'm directly moving all these 3 scenarios inside one try catch block. Okay, so this will also handle this thing efficiently. Let's see how this works. Let's hit send. All is fine with 3. Let's change it to 2. That's, last time it had thrown null pointer exception, but this time it is working perfectly fine. Let's change it to 1, and this time also this is giving us 1. If we go to the exceptions track trace, we see nice red colored exception tracings. So we can easily point out our exceptions string index out of range. Okay, this is one exception we had set up, and then we have the null pointer exception that is coming from Java line number 18. If we go back, this is the line it is coming from. Going back to the console, we can scroll up and we can find our first exception. Runtime. Okay, relax, this is a demo. So this is one of the basic ways of handling the exception in Spring Boot application, but not the ideal or not the best, or even what I'm trying to come up with, that also maybe not the best. So there are always room for better. Okay, so in order to more efficiently handle these kind of exceptions, okay, Spring Boot has provided us with an annotation called controller advice. Before I go to that controller advice topic, I can also mention that we can probably throw this, instead of handling this exception right here, we can probably propagate this exception to the caller of this method, and also this will go back to the controller, and there also it will throw this exception, and we can also have the same try catch block there as well, or maybe even throw or maybe propagate that exception further. Okay, but again, that in that case we are not handling it anymore. Okay, so now let's go to the controller advice topic. We'll see. Okay, now have our controller advice class. Under exception handling package, I'm going to have exceptions package, and then I'm going to name our class handler, exception handler. Okay, and this class I'm going to annotate with controller advice. So now we are telling Spring Boot to use this class to handle exceptions that are kind of not handled in the application. Okay, so this is a very basic global exception handler class, and now we need to configure whatever exceptions we want to handle in this exception handler class. So as we already have seen in our home service, we are trying to cover 3 scenarios. Okay, one was the string index out of bounds exception, another one was the null pointer exception, and the last one was the runtime exceptions. Okay, so public string handle, let's say we name this as string index out of bounds exception. Okay, and I'm going to return API error. Okay, so this is again a very basic method. It has till now nothing to do with exception handling, but when we annotate this with exception handler, okay, and then we pass the value as string index out of bounds exception dot class, now we have this. Now this is going to be used as an exception handler, and Since this is also going to be used as a Spring response, I mean the API response, we need to annotate this with response body and response status, as we are considering this as an error. HTTP, I think that's status dot internal server error. Okay, so we are handling that here, and let's go back to our service class, and I'm no longer handling these exceptions here. I'll adjust the lines so they are back to their positions and ready to throw exceptions. Okay, now let's just a minute. I hope I have saved everything. Okay, let's restart this. The application has started again, and let's try with 1 again. Now our controller advice is working. Okay, see the API error message we got. This is the same message that we had configured here. Okay, API error. And now if I go with number 2, that is the null pointer exception, we don't have that handled. Okay, we're still getting 500 error. Okay, for that we can again have similar kind of configuration, and this is going to be null pointer exception. Okay, and instead of this will have null pointer exception. Okay, and similarly we should do the same for the runtime exception as well. Alright, they are all returning the same message. Okay, and just for readability, I'm changing this to the first message, string index exception. This is a very basic message I'm using, and null pointer exception, and this is going to be runtime exception. This is it. So then we go inside our home service, everything remains as it is. Come back here and let's restart things. Application has started again, and we come back to our controller. Now let's start with 1, which is string index exception. Perfect. Then we go with 2, expecting a null pointer exception handling. There we are. And then we have this last exception, that is runtime. Perfect. And if we try anything else, 4, well, all is fine with 4. That is the exact behavior we had. So with this approach, we don't have to write try catch blocks in in any place of this application except this global exception handler class, which is working as a controller advice. Okay, we have one place for handling these kinds of exception, or we can also combine these exceptions into one configuration. Let me show that to you, how we can do that. Okay, we don't, since we already have an understanding that these are all runtime errors. For that we can probably have a better configuration, I would say. And this is the null pointer exception, and then we have the runtime exception. I'm going to get rid of these exceptions because once this works, everything will be redundant. Okay, and we don't need this message at all now. Okay, Now let's restart. Oh, we also don't need this. Because this is going to be covered for multiple scenarios. Let's restart. Our application has started again, and now let's start with 1 again. API error, and then we go with 2, again API error, and again with 3. There we go. All these 3 scenarios. Let's try with 5. All is fine, obviously. So as we can see that we have handled all this exception in a much better way. Our code is much neater. I mean, this is definitely, we have done it for purpose, for demonstrations, but in ideal scenarios we should not be having these, we may have these kind of codes, and they may throw exception for any reason. Okay, so another point I would like to add here is when we are handling the exceptions, it's also useful, I mean that's very useful to record this trace of this exception. For that I'm going to handle that with a method argument. Yes, controller advice thankfully injects whatever exception type we have provided here. We have this throwable, and I'm going to cover that dot print stack trace. Okay, let's see if that works. Seems like the application has started. Going back to our application. Oh, before that, let's clear the console. We want to read the stack trace. API error. Here we go. Okay, same exception message we have. Clear it again, and then go with 2. Hit send. Again API error. Again we have stack trace, null pointer exception. Again let's clear this. Now for runtime exception with 3, hit send. We have API error again, and if you scroll up we see runtime exception with the expected message. Alright, so this is the way we can handle exceptions in Spring Boot application. Okay, now let's cover some more real-time scenarios. Okay, inside exceptions package I'm going to have 3 more exception classes. Let's start with application exception and extends runtime exception. Okay, and I'm going to override one of its constructor. Similarly, I'm going to have 2 more, and this is going to be no data found exception. Okay, this also extends runtime exception, and I'm again going to do the same thing here, and I'll do the same thing again for the next exception class, and that is going to be validation exception. Okay, well, this looks like we are trying to create duplicate stuff, but we have a different use case for these actually, as these 3 kinds of exceptions are associated with 3 kinds of response codes. Okay, I'm considering application exception with 500 exception error, no data found with either 404 or 204 except status codes, and validation exception it can be 401. Okay, and I'm going back to our home service. Okay, Now I'll put these method below. I'll have some more scenarios now. Now if int, oh I'm sorry, if num equals 10, then we throw no data found exception. Okay, and I'm giving a message no data found. Okay, I'm sorry, there we go. Similarly, I'm copying this thing for the remaining scenarios. If this is 20, validation exception, validation error. Similarly with 30, I'm associating with application exception. Application error. Now let me give you some information on why, at what conditions these kind of exceptions are useful. For example, when you are hitting an API query to the endpoint, and that does not return any data, it's empty, you can deliberately or explicitly throw this no data found exception that can be handled in the global exception handler, which is the controller advice, and from there accordingly we can return a response code, okay, along with the response message. Similarly, in case of validation exception, the exception can cover scenarios such that when you are trying to post a JSON object, okay, to the API, and you are doing a validation, once you receive that post objects in the API, and at some point of time the validation fails or it does not meet the a certain criteria, you want to reject that request, okay. So in that case you can explicitly throw this validation exception, okay, and you can associate that 401 or 401 status code for this exception. And the third scenario is the application exception. Under this scenario we can cover scenarios such that your application is expecting data source information which is kind of unavailable at the configuration layer. Okay, in that case you can explicitly throw this exception and log that exception message in the stack trace or in the log file, saying that the database configurations are not found. Okay, let me change this message to the proper one. Database configurations are missing, cannot start application. Okay, I think this is exceeding the line. Let me add a new line. Okay, so this is it. So as part of this we are covering 3 more scenarios that they are more like real-time scenarios, and let's go back to our global exception handler, and this time we are going to have separate methods for separate status codes. Yeah, for separate different status codes we have to use different methods. Handle no data found. Again, I'm going to use the throwable. Okay, return API error. Okay, and again I'm using the annotation exception handler, and the value is going to be no data found exception dot class. Okay, I think in this scenario it's better to write no data found. Okay, and 2 more annotations we need is response body and response status, and for HTTP status we need no data not found. I think yes, this is the one. Okay, no data found. And similarly, we are going to create another method for this is going to be handle application exception. I'm going to change this exception to application exception. Okay, API error is still fine. Okay, here and similarly we again need another method for the validation exception. Okay, and I'm going to change this to validation, and I'm also going to change this error message as well. So now we have 3 dedicated messages, and I'm sorry I missed out to change the response codes as well. Application handler, it is going to be internal server error, and for validation it is going to be bad request. Okay, now let's restart our server. Application has started. Let me clear the console and let's go back to the home service and let's review what exceptions were linked to which numbers. 10 has no data found exception, 20 has validation exception, and 30 has application exception. Okay, let's go back to our Postman, and now I'm hitting 10. We have no data found, and now we see here the status code has changed to 404. Earlier it was 500. This is the status code that we are explicitly returning. Okay, then we change this to 20. Okay, so for 20 I think we had validation exception. Ideally we have mapped this to 401. Let's hit this. Okay, I'm sorry, that's not 401, that's 400. That's bad request. Okay, 401 is more associated with authentication. Okay, validation exception we have, and then we have the last one is 30, that is application exception, that is going to be 500. Okay, API error and 500 internal server. This time our message looks neat, but again this is kind of subjective. You can have your own style of writing the of returning the response objects. Okay, so this is pretty much how we can handle exceptions in Spring Boot Spring Boot applications. Okay, and as part of this I'm going to cover another special case. Okay, as I already had mentioned earlier that I'll add one more dependency, for which I'm going to do now. I'm going to pom.xml, and I'm going to add another dependency. Okay, I'm going to add a new dependency that is going to be Spring Boot starter validation. I think this is the one. Okay, we have this added, and then I have to reload the Maven configurations. Okay, and as part of this I'm going to add a new Java class. I'm going to have this in a different package, person request DTO. Okay, and as part of this person request DTO class I'm going to add few fields. Private string first name, private string last name, again private string, email, and private string age. Okay, and I need setters and getters for this. I'm going to select all of them and I have them generated for me. Okay, so we can do this also with Lombok, but I'm not going for that subject. And then on these fields we are going to have some validation annotations. Okay, I'm starting with not null, and I'm going to add a message here. Okay, first name is required. Okay, similar annotation I'm going to add for last name, and then we have same for email, and we have same for age. I'm sorry, I had to change the age variable type. Age is required. Okay, I hope I have the same change here. Integer and integer. There we go. We come back to top, and then we have to go to the home controller, and now we need a different endpoint. I'm going to name this as save person, and this takes person request DTO. Okay, request DTO, and we need another annotation here as request body. Okay, and then we are going to map this to post mapping. Okay, and this is going to be person associated to, and yes, I think this should be pretty much okay. And from here I'm just returning person saved. Okay, now since we are doing validation, I'm going to add another annotation as validated. Okay, so what's expected here is, so when we send a person object, for that person object, all the annotations we have given as part of the validation API, okay, so it will be checked. If this is null, then it will throw a validation error with the same message, first name is required. Same goes for all the other fields. Okay, this is one example of not null. I can also, there are different or many examples of validations. For example, I can also have size, and I can tell validation API to use the minimum length for a name as 2, and the max can go up to let's say 10, and then we can specify the message as first name should be between 2 and 10 characters. Okay, so now let's see how this behaves. Let's restart the server, and looks like the server has started. And now I'm going to our postman, and I'm going to change this to post request. I'm going to clear this, and I'm going to wait, before going to body, we need to add few more request params. Oh, I'm sorry, not here. It should be in headers. Okay, content type, this is going to be application/JSON. Okay, and when I go to body, I'm going to select raw, and I'm just passing an empty object or empty JSON. The person. Okay, now let's send it, and now we have 400 as bad request. Okay, now let's go to the stack trace and we see nothing here. Okay, but yes, we have one validation message. Surprisingly, this is just a warning. Okay, but we want to track this. Okay, we want to handle this. Okay, in order to handle this kind of exception, I have a set of code that I'm going to copy paste directly in the global exception handler. Okay, I'm going to import all the things that are not part of it. Okay, so method argument not valid exception. This is the exception that is thrown whenever a constraint has been violated or the validation has failed. In order to handle this exception, we are going to have a different method, and here also we are going to return the same bad request. Okay, and then the exception that we get here, we are accessing its API in order to collect all the error messages that is coming with the exception stack trace. Okay, see, we are collecting all the error messages and then we are appending it with the validation error string. Okay, now let's have this and let's restart this. Okay, I think this has started. Now try to do the same thing again. Now here is the exception message we have. Validation error. The messages are last name is required, email is required, first name is required, and age is required. Now if we remember, let's see, we also have the stack trace as well, the same method argument not valid exception, right? Because we are printing the stack trace inside this method now. If we go to the person request DTO, we had another validation. Okay, now let's copy this first name. Let's come back to Postman, and I'm going to pass this one as another annotation, and this time this is going to be N, just single character I'm passing. Okay, let's see if that changes the the validation messages. Okay, see, last name is required, email is required, age is required, but the validation error with the first name has changed this time. First name should, okay, I have to correct the spelling for the should. First name should be between 2 and 10 characters. Okay, so this is how we can handle the exception in Spring Boot applications. Okay, this was the place I had to fix. Okay, now we have the last scenario. So in case if there is an exception, we have no idea where it may come from. Okay, we are not always 100% sure that all the exception scenarios has been covered. We can try our best to cover as much scenarios as possible, but but it doesn't guarantee that all the exceptions has been covered. Okay, so in order to ensure that kind of situation, okay, we have to handle this on a different level. I'm going to name it as handle unknown exceptions. Okay, API error, and I'm going to annotate this with exception handler with exception class. This is the superclass for probably 95% or maybe more exception classes that we use in Java applications. Okay, and then we have to log this. Okay, so this is another scenario we have, we can probably cover one, but make sure that we keep this thing at the end. Okay, response body and response status we have, and again HTTP status dot internal server error. Okay, I think we can probably make all these as static imports. Okay, that's it. Let's see if we have any unused Java imports. Perfect, we don't have any. That's it. So I think this is pretty much we can cover as part of exception handling. So this cover most of the real-time scenarios, especially this method argument not valid exception. You would get this with the validation API. And one more important point I had missed to cover. I apologize for that. See, all the application or the custom applications we have used, they all extend the runtime exception. Okay, so any custom application we use, we make sure that it extends the runtime exception. Only then controller advice will work. If it is not a runtime exception, it better be just exception. Okay, if it is not exception, okay, then it better have an runtime exception as its superclass. Otherwise, controller advice will completely ignore that. Okay, so yeah, so in these scenarios, if you see string index out of bounds exception, null pointer exceptions, both these exceptions extend null runtime exception. If we open this null pointer exception right here, we can see this extends runtime exception. Okay, so this is pretty much that I could cover today. I know this is not the 100%, and it's hard to say that what is the accurate percentage it covers as part of exception handling in Spring Boot. But the idea is to cover as much as I could. Okay, and yes, I hope this should be good to start with. And thanks for watching this video.